This seat is not yours. Move to the main cabin now.
If you refuse, we will deplane you in front of everyone.
Then deplane me in front of everyone. But check your system first.
Ma'am, step out with us or we will remove you.
I will cooperate, but I will not leave until this record is corrected.
The air seemed to freeze. Passengers stopped mid-sentence. Phones tilted up. The engine's low hum suddenly louder. Every eye was fixed on the woman standing against a system bigger than her, waiting to see which would first break her resolve, or the rules. Would justice take her side this time? The story doesn't end here. Naomi is about to face a bigger challenge. Do you agree with the way Naomi acted? Write your thoughts below, and like the channel to spread the message. Her assistant's voice echoed in her memory from that morning, a gentle nudge that felt like a promise and a deadline at once. Make the board meeting in Atlanta. The deal is important. Do not miss it. Naomi Carter carried that reminder with her as the jet bridge sighed and the gate announcements rolled through the concourse in soft waves. A familiar chorus of welcomes, warnings, and final calls. The October light in Denver slid across the wide windows by gate B-22, turning the rolling plains beyond into a muted gold. Travelers in sweaters and light jackets clutched paper cups that smelled of cinnamon and coffee. A kid dragged a pumpkin-patterned backpack. Somewhere behind the counter, a barista laughed at a private joke. Naomi adjusted her blazer and stepped into the first-class cabin with the quiet efficiency of someone who had lived in airports long enough to know where to look for calm. She settled into seat 1A, set her leather folio on the tray, and woke the tablet that held her briefing for Atlanta. The numbers in those pages were not just numbers. They were nurses hired, clinics opened, patients treated. She liked to read them that way, as a ledger of lives. The cabin around her hummed with the low sound of zipped luggage and domestic rituals. A man folded his coat with deliberate care. A woman texted what sounded like a good night to a grandchild. Two friends argued amiably about whether to split a salad or risk the cookie. Naomi breathed in, steady and even. She touched the edge of the boarding pass tucked into the folio, as if confirming something simple and unremarkable. A place was hers because she had prepared and paid for it. "Ma'am, may I see your ticket again?" The voice was polite, pitched to be heard over the ambient noise without intruding. Naomi looked up into the composed face of Jessica Reed, the lead flight attendant, whose name badge glinted like a small, flat star. Naomi offered the pass with a small smile. Of course. Jessica studied it, her expression remaining courteous but acquiring a faint ridge of concentration between the brows. She glanced at the cabin, at the tablet in her hand, back at Naomi. "I'll just double-check something. Please hold on a moment." A young man paused near the bulkhead, his phone held in both hands as if he were cradling a bird. Naomi had noticed him earlier at the gate, narrating into the camera with a practiced lightness. He occupied that easy space between observer and participant, the place where stories often begin. His sweatshirt read Brooks Travel, and he smiled at his viewers as he slid into seat 2C. The phone screen skated briefly over Naomi's roll before dipping down to the armrest, and his voice dropped to a murmur. The captain's announcement drifted from the overhead speakers. Warm and routine. "Welcome aboard. We expect a smooth ride. A little after 3 in the afternoon departure. A tailwind that might make us early. Thank you for choosing us." Naomi let the words wash over her as she scrolled the executive summary. She thought of Atlanta in the late light, of a driver waiting with a handwritten placard, of a conference room where she would speak about expanding access to care. She pictured the board members' faces not as obstacles but as allies who needed evidence. The tablet screen reflected her calm gaze back at her, a quiet pact. "Stay steady," Jessica returned, tablet in hand, the polite smile now taut, professional. "Ma'am," she said, softer, "could I also see a government-issued ID?" It was not the first time Naomi had heard that tone, a careful blend of apology and authority that let the request stand without accusing. She reached for her wallet. "Here you are. Driver's license, boarding pass, the tools of moving through the world." Jessica examined them both, eyes flicking with the brisk rhythm of an efficient checklist. Around them, the small, ordinary theater of pre-departure continued. Overhead bins clicked shut like punctuation. A passenger stowed a cane. Another passed a magazine forward to a friend. The young vlogger, Ethan, Naomi recalled from a passing introduction at the gate, whispered into his phone, the words indistinct but the cadence attentive. Across the aisle, a man in a sports jacket watched with the steady curiosity of someone who has seen enough airports to recognize when something was shifting out of the ordinary. "Thank you," Jessica said, returning the license and pass. "I'm going to take these to my system one more time." There may be a mismatch with the seat assignment. The phrase was neutral and almost delicate. but Naomi felt the slightest chill of familiarity move along her skin, the way a draft finds your wrist under a cuff. She kept her voice even. If there's a mismatch, it will be in the system, not on my ticket. Jessica nodded and stepped away. The cabin seemed to refocus around the empty space by Naomi's role, the way a room leans toward a quiet conversation. Naomi closed her folio and folded her hands. She was not angry. She recognized anger as a quick flame that ate oxygen. What she felt was a careful, deliberate stillness, a tuning of the air to the true note of what was happening. The captain walked through first class on his way to the cockpit, exchanging brief greetings. He carried himself with the assurance of long practice. His eyes slid over the cabin like a lighthouse beam. He paused when Jessica spoke to him just beyond Naomi's shoulder. The words were low, but the shape of the conversation announced itself. A check, a query, a tiny hitch in the departure narrative. He gave a courteous nod toward Naomi's row and moved on, the set of his shoulders a little more contained. Ethan's phone angled again, not in a predatory way, but with the discreet curiosity of a chronicler. Naomi caught his eye and he gave an almost imperceptible shrug, as if to say, I am telling the story of travel, and sometimes travel tells a harder story back. A woman 2 rows behind cleared her throat in that subtle communal signal. That means we all have places to be. Another voice, friendly, not unkind, murmured, I hope this doesn't hold us up. I see. Jessica returned for the 3rd time, the tablet a slim gray question mark in her hands. Ma'am, she said, still courteous, our records are not showing this seat as yours. There may have been a change. Would you mind if I ask you to step out for a moment while we sort it out at the gate? The sentence was framed as a request, nestled in the down of policy. The eyes nearby were not hostile, but they were watchful. Naomi could feel the cabin's patience like a tide moving under her feet. She breathed once, slow. Her assistant's reminder rang again like a bell struck far away. The board meeting in Atlanta. The deal is important. Do not miss it. Naomi opened the folio and withdrew the printed boarding pass. Not because she doubted the digital one, but because paper carries an old-fashioned weight that a screen sometimes lacks. She laid it flat on the tray, the ink crisp, the name and seat plain as day. She turned her driver's license so it faced Jessica. Her voice, when it came, was calm enough to steady a loose hinge. Jessica, she said, using the name she had read, I understand your need to verify. I also need you to understand that I prepared for this flight as carefully as you prepared this cabin. She glanced toward the window, where a tug traced a deliberate arc on the tarmac, then back to the attendant's lined, tirelessly resolute face. The rituals of travel make professionals of all of us. They also teach us how thin the line is between courtesy and doubt. A few rows back, someone whispered, it's probably a simple mistake. Another voice, older, answered, they always say that, until it isn't. The words did not carry judgment so much as weary recognition. Naomi raised her chin a fraction, enough to reclaim the small geography of her seat. She could feel the story trying to cast her in a role she did not accept. Jessica's smile did not falter, but her eyes asked for the shortest path to compliance. Let me double-check this doesn't look right. The phrase returned, identical but heavier, as if repeated use had turned it from courtesy into a shield. Naomi heard the cadence and knew it well. It lived at the border between explanation and erasure. She thought of Atlanta again, of a room where her voice would count in votes and budgets, in a map of clinics stretching across counties. She thought of elders who had taught her that dignity is not a luxury but a daily practice, sometimes quiet, sometimes firm. She thought, too, of how easily a small moment can echo into a larger one if you let it pass unchallenged. The cabin's air felt cool against her wrist. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not change her posture. She simply gathered the boarding pass and the license into the space between her hands, as if they were a prayer book, and looked Jessica Reed in the eye. I booked this seat 3 weeks ago. Check your system again. The words she had just spoken still hung in the cabin like a plucked string, faintly vibrating. She had booked the seat weeks ago. The system could be checked again. Jessica Reed felt the echo of that firmness and walked a careful line between courtesy and control. But the clock of departure pressed against her temple like a thumb. She signaled to a colleague with a practiced tilt of her chin and stepped toward the forward galley, the slim tablet in her hand, holding a screen that refused to agree with the paper Naomi Carter had placed on her tray. The first-class lights were warm, almost generous. They made everything look softer than it felt. Around Naomi, the rituals of waiting resumed in smaller, tighter motions. Someone closed a laptop, someone else folded a scarf. The magazine pages in row 3 turned more slowly than before. A murmur ran along the aisle like a wind moving through leaves. She would have preferred to remain invisible, to let the ordinary kindness of travel do its work. Please, thank you. Would you like sparkling or still? But the narrow corridor of doubt had been opened, and now the crew had to walk it. In the cockpit doorway, Captain Richard Hayes paused with the posture of a man who understood that authority is sometimes a performance and sometimes a duty you cannot set down. Jessica spoke to him in a low voice pitched precisely for privacy. Naomi could not hear the words, but she heard the shape of them. The captain's gaze slid to the boarding pass on Naomi's tray, to the license beside it, and then, reflexively, to Naomi's face. He nodded to Jessica, a small, definitive gesture, and made a brief call over the interphone. Naomi's breath stayed even. She had learned long ago that breath is a kind of ownership. She thought of Atlanta waiting in the late light, and of a conference room where decisions would enlarge a network of clinics by a number written in careful lines and commas. She imagined speaking to trustees who had the skeptical kindness of people who wanted to be convinced. She remembered this morning's reminder once more, make the board meeting, and felt it settle in her like a weight that steadied rather than pressed. Across the aisle, a woman with gray hair and an attentive mouth watched with the doctor's stillness, measuring not only what was said, but what was not. Ethan Brooks, in seat 2C, angled his phone with the caution of someone trained by experience to stay on the safe side of a line. He had begun his stream at the gate with a cheerful list of Denver food options and a comment about the October sky, but now his voice changed. He told his viewers that something unusual was unfolding. He did not say names, he did not aim at faces. He gave the scene without verdict, and the chat responded the way crowds do, with 100 small voices that become a single sound: concern, advice, and the old American instinct to witness. Jessica returned with a firmer carriage, as if policy had laid a hand between her shoulder blades. "Ma'am," she said to Naomi, choosing a tone that sounded like patience in uniform, "our system still shows a different assignment for this seat. The gate can help us resolve the mismatch quickly if you'll step out with me." Naomi gestured to the paper and the license with a calm palm. "Everything you need is here." Jessica kept her smile, but the edges of it cooled. "I understand, and I promise we'll do our best. But we cannot hold the cabin while we figure it out." A man in row 4 cleared his throat in a neighborly way that was almost apologetic. The doctor across the aisle glanced at the paper on Naomi's tray, then at the tablet in Jessica's hand, then at Naomi, and something in her gaze said she had weighed these kinds of moments in exam rooms and hallways, and she knew the cost of being asked to justify herself twice. The captain appeared again, this time stopping at Naomi's row. His voice pitched so that it reached only those who needed to hear it, but inevitably touched the ears of many. "Ma'am, I am responsible for this flight schedule and safety. We need you to take your assigned seat in the main cabin, or we will have to rebook you on a later flight." He spoke like a man who prided himself on being reasonable. Naomi's answer was gentle, and it was a refusal. "The seat I am in is the seat I purchased. The documents are in front of you." She did not lift them. She let them rest where they were, as if their weight might be felt through the laminate. The captain's jaw did a small, weary thing that spoke of 100 mornings and 1,000 tiny delays. "This is my final warning," he said, and the words left a faint chill in the air, because they arrived wrapped in procedure rather than anger. Laura Stevens came down the aisle with the forward momentum of someone who keeps a terminal humming by sheer will. Her badge read supervisor, and the clipped radio on her belt whispered other people's emergencies. She had the face of a woman who had calmly escorted crying families to rebooking desks and had soothed businessmen who believed timetables spoke the truth. She took in the tableau paper, license, tablet, captain, passenger, and the plan formed in the narrow band of seconds she could afford. "Ma'am," she said, her voice even and edged, "I can offer you 2 options right now. We can reseat you in the main cabin, so we can depart, or we can move you to the next available flight where first class is guaranteed. I need your decision." It was the kind of sentence that sounds like a choice and feels like a corner. Naomi did not look away. She found the doctor's eye across the aisle, and in that quick human bridge, she felt something quieter than support and steadier than sympathy, recognition. She returned her attention to Laura. "Neither of those options addresses the fact that this is the seat I paid for and was assigned." Laura's fingers tightened on the radio. She was not cruel. She was busy. She believed in fairness as a function of flow. "We cannot adjudicate at the seat," she said. "We have to clear the aisle." Behind her, 2 passengers who had been on their phones exchanged the small shrug of strangers aligning against an inconvenience. Another voice, older and careful, said softly, She showed them her papers. And the stream on Ethan's phone ticked upward in a way that registered in his posture. He did not announce numbers, but he felt the wave. He narrated in a low tone so the audio would favor the room rather than his commentary, describing only what anyone could see. A supervisor at the front, a captain standing, a passenger staying seated with documents on her tray. In the chat, a commenter typed that this was what accountability looked like. Another wrote that the airline would fix it in a minute. Another said the opposite. The captain spoke again, and this time his voice carried a little farther than he intended, because he felt the departure time nearing like a narrowing door. "We will contact airport security if we need to," he said. It was not a threat, not in his mind. It was a lever available to a man tasked with keeping an economy moving on schedule. The words fell into the silence and made a tiny dent that everyone could feel. Naomi inhaled once and thought of elders who had taught her that grace is strength made visible. She also thought, very practically, that the minutes spent here would be measured again later in a boardroom where minutes cost money and choices multiplied. The doctor across the aisle, her name was Susan Miller, and she carried the contained energy of someone trained to speak when it matters, leaned forward just enough so that her voice was part of the conversation without making a spectacle of it. "Excuse me," she said. I watched her present her boarding pass and her identification. They matched the name on her seat. I would like that to be part of the record of what is happening. Laura turned to her with a professional nod that recognized both the statement and the speaker's composure. "Thank you, ma'am. We are working to verify." The verifying did not seem to move. Naomi felt the patience of the cabin compress into a smaller point, the way a heartbeat becomes louder when you are very still. She imagined, with a detached tenderness, how this must look from the aisle or the screen. A woman composed, not combative, a paper boarding pass, anchoring a claim to a square of space and the dignity that came with it. She could feel the shape of an older story drifting into the edges of this one. The story in which a person is politely escorted away from what is hers, and she felt something in her spine say that she would not be part of that version. Laura shifted from persuasion to procedure. "If you will not accept either option," she said, "we will have to remove you from the aircraft to resolve this at the gate." Naomi's reply was level enough to rest a cup on. "I am not preventing you from checking the system. I am simply insisting that you check it correctly." Jessica, who had seen storms pass through cabins and vanish without leaving a mark, found herself thinking about the line between hospitality and habit. She stood with her tablet, not unkind and not unsure, but with a sense that the cabin itself was learning a lesson about how easily trust frays. The aisle gathered witnesses. A man in row 4 pulled his bag a little closer to his knees. A couple in row 3 whispered, then stopped whispering because whispering seemed wrong. Ethan's stream continued to describe the scene, and he found himself saying a sentence he had not planned, that the woman in 1A was calm, that her documents were visible, that the crew seemed determined to move her. In the chat, a viewer typed that they had been asked twice to prove a seat and the second time had felt different from the first. Another wrote that policy is only as fair as the people who apply it. The captain signaled to Laura with a small nod of a man unwilling to inflame and unable to yield. She picked up her radio and spoke quietly. In the front galley, Jessica exhaled in a long, thin line, the kind that lets stress leave the body without making a sound. Naomi watched each face. The captain's gathered patience, the supervisor's crisp efficiency, the attendant's duty, the doctor's watchful steadiness. She thought of the meeting in Atlanta again, not as a reason to surrender, but as a reason to remain exactly who she was in this moment, someone who believed that systems should bend toward fairness when shown the facts. "Ma'am," Laura said, replacing the radio on her belt, "I am asking you one last time to move to the main cabin so that we can depart." The language of request did its work and did not. Naomi placed her palm lightly on the paper boarding pass, not to hide it, but to claim it. "I will remain in the seat I purchased," she said. The words were not loud. They entered the air like a key turned in a lock that had resisted and then yielded. The captain's eyes softened in the way that meant he understood something about resolve and something about the cost of it. From the rear of the cabin, 2 figures in dark uniforms appeared, moving with the pace of people who are trained to be visible without seeming aggressive. Their presence changed the temperature of the room by a few degrees. Conversations ended like candles pinched between fingers. Ethan's phone trembled almost imperceptibly as his hand adjusted, and his voice lowered further, a steadying line of narration that tried not to lean toward drama. The doctor across the aisle straightened in her seat, her attention tightening as if to a delicate procedure. Laura stepped aside enough to give the newcomer space, and the captain took one half step back to let policy occupy the foreground. One of the officers stopped at Naomi's row and spoke in a tone that could have sold a watch or delivered a verdict. If she won't comply, we'll escort her out. She could still feel the air tighten around Captain Hayes' final warning. The way a room holds its breath when a fragile glass begins to tip. The boarding door remained open, the jet bridge breathing cool October air into the front galley, and the scent of coffee from the concourse drifted in like a softer memory of ordinary travel. Naomi Carter kept her hands folded on the leather folio and let her breath move steady and slow. She reminded herself of the promise that morning had carried. Reach Atlanta in time. Speak plainly. Move the work forward. That promise was not leaving her now. It sat beside her like a quiet companion, urging her to remain herself. A pair of airport security officers approached with a measured pace of people trained to appear without inflaming. Their uniforms were neat and unadorned by swagger. The older officer, a man with a calm baritone and crow's feet that suggested he preferred conversation to confrontation, stopped just shy of Naomi's armrest. "Ma'am," he said, "we've been asked to help verify a seating issue. Would you mind stepping out to the gate with us? It will be quicker to confirm outside the cabin." He did not loom. He did not raise his voice. He offered a path that sounded neutral and practical, a road often traveled by people who want trouble to resolve itself. Naomi glanced at the paper, boarding pass resting on her tray, and then at the officer's steady eyes. "I am willing to cooperate with verification," she said in an even tone, "and I am willing to stand at the gate for that conversation. I will not leave this gate area until the facts are checked carefully." The officer gave a short nod that signaled both understanding and the quiet relief of a reasonable reply. Laura Stevens, all clipped competence and radio static, gestured toward the forward door. "Let's clear the aisle," she said, not unkindly. Around them, passengers adjusted bags and folded hands and learned, yet again, how thin the wall is between privacy and spectacle. Naomi rose, not in surrender, but in order to move the conversation where evidence could be handled. The folio tucked under her arm, she walked with the officers to the threshold where the jet bridge met the aircraft. The concourse beyond looked like a river, slowed by stones. Strollers, rolling suitcases, the occasional burst of laughter, a man counting out cash for a sandwich, a woman tipping $1 into a barista's jar with a nod and a thank you. The ordinary world kept going. Inside the plane, the extraordinary had paused it. At the gate desk, a young agent with careful hair and the worried focus of someone newly entrusted with authority pulled up the reservation system. Jessica stood at a slight angle, not blocking Naomi's view but not inviting it either. Captain Hayes remained by the curtain line and anchored to procedure. Dr. Susan Miller, the woman from across the aisle with a clinician's stillness, had followed at a respectful distance and now stood where she could see without intruding. Ethan Brooks hovered just inside the cabin with his phone held low. His voice had shifted from cheerful patter to quiet narration, and the audience on the other side of the glass rectangle had multiplied into the many. He did not say the number, but the chat scrolled faster, and somewhere in that sea the count pushed past 1,000. He chose his words with care, describing only what anyone could witness. The passengers' documents set neatly on the counter, the supervisor's radio catching faint bursts of other problems, the captain's patient rigidity, the officer's steady patience. "Name and confirmation code, please," the gate agent asked, and Naomi provided them in a tone that belonged in a library rather than a skirmish. The agent typed, frowned, typed again, then turned toward Laura with the face of someone who trusts the system and fears it in equal measure. "I am seeing 2 records," he said softly. "One shows first class, seat 1A, purchased 3 weeks ago. The other shows a reassignment. I do not see who initiated it." Laura's posture refused to absorb either relief or admission. "We will make it right," she said, "after we clear the problem that is holding the flight." As a river. The older officer looked at Naomi as if to ask whether she wanted him to say what he was thinking. She answered by remaining very still. "Doctor." Miller stepped forward half a pace, a motion that told everyone she was not here to escalate but to record the truth. "For the record," she said, her voice mild and firm, "I watched this passenger present a paper boarding pass and a license that matched. I also watched the staff speak to each other in low tones while the passenger remained cooperative. She could have been dictating a chart note. She was, in a sense." Jessica exhaled through her nose, and her eyes flicked to the tablet in her hand as if the screen might suddenly instruct her on grace. Naomi placed her fingertips lightly on the folio, centering herself in the familiar. She thought of elders who gave counsel in stories that sounded like weather reports. This is how storms move, and this is how you will stand when they pass. She thought of the board meeting that awaited her in Atlanta, and how she would rather arrive late with her dignity intact than early at the cost of agreeing that doubt had a right to sit in her seat. The gate's digital display ticked the delay from a handful of minutes to a few more. No one sighed. Or, if they did it quietly. Laura's voice found that firm register where choice becomes directive. "Ma'am, you have two options," she said. "Accept a seat in the main cabin so we can depart, or rebook onto a later flight where we can guarantee first class." The sentence was tidy, balanced, almost soothing in its symmetry. Naomi listened to the shape of it, then to the silence that followed, and recognized the old structure of a corner disguised as an invitation. She did not lift her chin so much as allow her posture to inhabit its full height. "Neither option recognizes what is true," she said. "The record you are seeing," she nodded toward the agents, "screen confirms my original assignment. I am not asking for an exception. I am asking you to honor what exists." Behind her, a few first-class passengers had stepped out, compelled by curiosity and the need to stretch legs that already dreaded a long sit. Two of them stood with arms crossed, broadcasting impatience, because impatience is the only power travelers can reliably claim. Another, a middle-aged man with a gentle face, slipped a small bill into a nearby tip jar with an apologetic smile, as if to redress the karmic balance of a scene he could not control. The Concourse speakers announced a final call for a different flight at a different gate. Ordinary life kept choosing to continue. "Ma'am," the older officer said, in that careful tone again, "if we cannot reach a resolution at the desk, we may have to move you to the public side while the airline sorts its records." He did not add what the public side felt like when you had been moved there. Naomi's eyes found his. "I intend to remain where the facts are," she said. "The facts are here." The agent swallowed and pressed the key with the hesitant hope of someone blowing on a stubborn ember. Ethan Stream caught the doctor's next words as she addressed the tray of documents as if it were a witness. "I want to note it that the passenger has remained calm, that she has answered every request, and that each new request has added to rather than reduced confusion. There was no heat in it. There was only the precision of naming what was visible." In the scrolling blur of comments, a viewer wrote that patience is not compliance. It is self-respect. Another wrote that procedures are not neutral when they consistently fall in one direction. Jessica lifted her chin as if to reclaim a portion of the cabin's promised serenity. "We are not accusing anyone," she said. "We are trying to depart on time." Time, which had been the quiet tyrant in every corner of this conversation, finally spoke its name. Naomi let silence stand for her for a beat, and then gave it words. "On time matters," she said softly, "and so does on principle. I know you." Laura glanced at the captain, who had grown more still as the scene gathered gravity. He was not an unkind man. He was a man who counted minutes for a living and had been trained to believe that fairness was the natural result of checking the right boxes. He spoke as someone who wanted this to be resolved later, somewhere else. "We can deal with compensation," he offered, "if you will help us take off now." "Doctor." Miller's eyes flicked to him the way a resident might glance at an attending when a diagnosis had been named too quickly. Around the desk, the temperature of the air seemed to drop by a degree. Naomi felt the shape of an older narrative pressing in, the one where the person with the least visible power is encouraged to be reasonable in the moment and to seek redress in the empty afterward. She steadied herself with a memory of purpose that ran deeper than today's itinerary. She opened the folio and, with a movement so ordinary it almost disguised its intent, touched the corner of a document tucked beneath the executive summary. Her phone vibrated once in her blazer pocket, the silent signal of an assistant whose timing was as precise as a metronome. She did not rush. She did not dramatize. She let the next choice arrive as naturally as breath entering the body. "Officer," she said to the older man, "thank you for your patience." Then to Laura, "Thank you for your clarity." Then to the gate agent, "Thank you for checking the record and not pretending you could not see it." She shifted her folio to her left hand and set her right palm lightly on the counter as if to ground the moment where it stood. "You are making a mistake," she said in a tone that refused heat and carried weight instead. "And you are about to find out why." A hush worked its way outward like a ripple settling. Ethan's audience leaned closer through glass and wire. Dr. Miller's shoulders relaxed by a fraction, as if something inevitable had at last been named. Jessica's eyes narrowed the way eyes do when light changes, and you are not sure at first whether to shade them or welcome what they show. Captain Hayes' jaw set, not from defiance, but from the reflex of a man bracing for an outcome he does not yet see. Naomi drew her phone from her pocket and pressed a single favorite. The ring never sounded. A prepared line connected immediately. She did not look around for approval or permission. She watched the gate agent's screen as if it were a dashboard measuring the weather in real time. The assistant's voice, crisp and close, waited on the other end for exactly what Naomi would say next. She did not raise her voice, because it did not need raising. She let it carry the steadiness of a person who had decided to be precisely who she was. In public, at cost if necessary. Connect me to Atlanta now. The hush arrived not because anyone ordered it, but because people know instinctively when the moment turns. Naomi stood at the gate counter with the late afternoon light from Denver slanting across the concourse, lending a gentle glow to faces that had grown tight with waiting. The jet bridge breathed a faint coolness into the doorway. Coffee stirred, lids clicked onto paper cups, a stroller wheel chirped as someone rolled past and then paused to look. Naomi glanced once at the paper boarding pass on the counter, as if to greet an old friend, then lifted her eyes to the small cluster that had formed. Jessica Reed, with her tablet held like a shield she did not wish to use. Captain Richard Hayes, posture set by years of departures and arrivals. Laura Stevens, radio on her hip, murmuring other people's problems. The older security officer with a voice tuned to avoid trouble. The younger officer learning the music of that tone. Dr. Susan Miller, quiet, attentive, choosing when to speak and when to let silence speak. And just inside the cabin, Ethan Brooks with his phone lowered, narrating in a hush that belonged more to a museum than to a terminal. Naomi let her breath set the tempo slow in, steady out, and then she did what steady people do when the air has been taught to doubt them. She named herself. She did not send the words like a flare. She placed them in the room the way you place a glass on a table so it will not tip. She said her name, full and calm, and said the work she led, a health group whose daily business was to turn budgets into care. She said that the group was not merely a customer of this airline, but a strategic investor with a significant stake, and when she spoke the figure 23%, she did it in the same tone she would use to tell a patient a blood pressure reading. Factual, unadorned, important because of what it meant next. Reactions moved across faces like weather across a prairie surprise first, then the wind of recalculation, then a stillness that had room for listening. The older officer's eyes softened. The way eyes do when the story they have been asked to keep orderly turns out to be larger than the line they drew around it. The younger officer studied the floor for a heartbeat, then returned his gaze to Naomi as if to say he was revising the map. Jessica's shoulders made a small adjustment. Not surrender, not defiance, but the body's quiet way of absorbing an unanticipated truth. Laura Stevens did what professionals do when the script changes. She kept her voice even and asked, "What would you like us to do now?" The captain did not move at all, which was its own movement. Naomi thanked the gate agent for his patience, and with a courtesy that did not cede ground, asked that the agent display the record on the counter screen so that all could see the original seat assignment. He adjusted the angle, and the names and letters glowed in the soft blue of airline systems everywhere. First class, seat 1A, purchased 3 weeks earlier. It looked as plain as a street sign, and, like a street sign, it meant nothing until you agreed to follow it. She spoke quietly about the second record, the one that had appeared without a clear author, and asked a simple question that opens complicated doors. Who had changed the entry, and when? The agent scrolled, swallowed, and admitted he could not see the author. Naomi did not scold him for not seeing what could not be seen. She kept the focus on what was visible. A purchase, a seat, a person. Ethan's narration, never dramatic, captured the turn with the gentleness of a newscaster who knows that the camera is made of nerves. His audience, now more than 1,000, pressed through glass and wire. He described the scene without verdict, names spoken, faces intent, a paper pass beside a glowing screen, the polite machinery of an apology not yet offered. In the chat, voices were what they always are, a chorus of advice, empathy, defensiveness, memory. Dr. Miller stepped closer by a fraction. For the record, she said in a clear clinic voice, I can confirm that I saw the original documents and that the passenger has been composed and cooperative. Her words settled on the counter like a neatly folded cloth placed under a fragile object. Naomi drew a small breath and, in that breath, gathered the work she had come here to do even before this moment chose her. She said that her intention was not punishment for its own sake, She said that dignity does not require a spectacle, but it requires witnesses. She said that she would be asking the airline's leadership to join her in repairing both the event and the habits that allow the event to happen. Then, with the same calm that had carried her through the morning's reminders, she asked the gate agent to place a video call to the executive office in Atlanta. She did not say the city like a threat. She said it like a home address. The screen on the counter bloomed into a live window. The image steadied to reveal a conference room across the country, a long table, a few open laptops, a wall display where graphs and maps waited like well-trained dogs. A woman in a navy blazer sat forward, sleeves just touching her wrists, her expression alert and unvarnished. "This is Helen Rogers," she said, voice even, vowels shaped by years of briefings and boardrooms. The sound came through the terminal's noise with surprising clarity, and for a beat, the concourse belonged to her. "What is happening at my gate?" The pronoun landed with the proper weight. Naomi introduced herself without flourish, as if this meeting had been scheduled all along. She described the sequence soberly. A boarding pass questioned, an identification repeated, words spoken not to her but about her, a reassignment without an author, a call for security. She did not dramatize the escalations. She placed them in order, which is one way to make a truth ring. Helen listened the way people listen when they know that both facts and reputations are in the room. The camera settled on her face, and the stillness gave others permission to be still. She asked the gate agent to confirm what the screen showed, and he did. Voice cautious, hands uneasy. She asked Laura to identify herself and confirm the options she had offered, and Laura did, voice professional, posture intact. She asked the captain for the timeline, and he delivered it concisely. A man doing the job he believed he had. There was no theater in it. There was only the recorded pace of a misunderstanding that had grown legs and started walking. Naomi thanked each of them and then turned the conversation to where it had to go if it was going to do more than put a bandage on a bruise. She said the airline had, at this moment, the opportunity to demonstrate what it claims to stand for. She said that good companies do not merely correct the record. They improve the way the record is kept. She said that the remedies she was about to propose were not punishments pulled from air, but measures drawn from experience of her own and that of communities who had watched similar scenes play in other rooms. She did not raise her voice to deliver the list. She slowed it so the room could receive each part. First, she said, there must be immediate accountability for the specific actions taken. Those who question without verifying, and those who threaten procedures before exhausting checks. That would mean suspension and review, and where appropriate, termination. The words did not haunt, they rested. Second, she said, within 30 days, every customer-facing employee should complete a bias recognition and dignity in service training program designed by a reputable third party, not a homegrown slide deck. Third, an anonymous reporting system must be established and operated by an external organization so that passengers and employees could report discrimination without fear of retaliation or of a report disappearing into a drawer. Fourth, a fund of $500,000 should be created and committed to programs that build equity in travel scholarships, community partnerships, and grants for research on fair service. Fifth, the company's executive compensation should be linked to measurable progress in dignity and inclusion outcomes with transparent quarterly reporting. The list was not a gauntlet thrown. It was a plan presented. Reactions moved again. The captain stood more upright, not because he agreed or disagreed, but because he recognized the voice speaking in the clean grammar of systems. Laura's eyes flicked briefly toward the first-class cabin, where patients and patrons will feel this day in one way, and workers will feel it in another. Jessica's hands eased their grip on the tablet by a single degree. The older security officer shifted his weight, as men do when a room starts to balance. Ethan, who had narrated flights delayed by storms and flights shortened by tailwinds, found his voice riding a different current. He said, in the same radio-warm tone he used for weather and food, that the woman at the counter had turned an incident into a blueprint. His audience wrote words like finally and listening and let us see what they do next. Helen did not answer immediately. She asked two questions that mattered. The first, how fast do you expect this to happen? The second, will you accept transparency as the guarantee? Naomi, who had spent years turning should into can and can into done, said that speed would demonstrate sincerity. She asked for visible steps within 72 hours. Interim materials pushed to staff, an external hotline stood up, a public notice that did not pretend nothing had happened. She asked for the larger training to be completed within 30 days, and for the fund to be named and seated within that same window. She said the reporting and the bonus metrics could be designed in concert with outside advisors, but should be announced promptly, with a timeline the public could understand. She was not bargaining, she was aligning. She did not speak of consequences or shares or leverage. She did not need to. The facts sat beside her, like patient advocates. Doctor Miller allowed a small space by the room's attention, offered one more line to the record, that the harm of moments like this often outlast the delay, and that the repair must acknowledge that human cost. She said it the way physicians say the important parts near the end of a visit. The older officer nodded almost imperceptibly, as if to file that sentence where it would not be lost. Laura thanked the doctor without a changing tone, which was her way of accepting a correction while keeping the room from tipping. Helen leaned closer to the camera. She did not smooth her cuff. She did not look at an aide. She looked at Naomi and the others as if they had all been waiting to choose who they wanted to be in front of each other. She acknowledged the facts as they had been presented. She said that the airline would take responsibility for the breakdown of verification and for the escalation that followed. She said that the remedies sounded appropriate and that the tie to executive compensation was, in her view, overdue. She did not say the word agreement. She let the shape of the room hold it. The concourse had grown so quiet that the ordinary language of travel, final calls, paging passengers by name, gate changes announced, seemed suddenly distant, like sounds from a neighboring house. The captain's jaw loosened a shade. Jessica exhaled as if she had been holding a small breath since the first question. Laura's radio hissed and then went still. Ethan's viewers wrote the kind of messages people type when they are alone at a screen and grateful to be in a crowd. Naomi did one more human thing before the decision. She turned slightly, bringing the first-class doorway into her peripheral view, and she spoke to that space. She said that she was sorry for the delay, that she knew people had connections and dinners and bedtime stories waiting, and that she would not have held them if there were another way to make the future of this flight kinder than the present had been. She did not ask for applause. None came. Something quieter did, a collective settling. The sense of a room, realizing that being late by a little can be the price of arriving better. When she faced the screen again, Helen's expression had not changed, but her eyes had. A decision had moved in behind them. She glanced to her right, where someone just out of frame handed her a folder and then back to the camera. And her voice, when it came, sounded like a gavel without the strike. Give me a minute to brief the board. Ruang Gong Tai. The screen returned with the same steady image of the Atlanta conference room, but the faces held a new resolve. A folder lay open before Helen Rogers, and a quiet gravity entered her voice as she spoke. She began by acknowledging what had happened at the gate, not in corporate language, but in plain words about verification that failed, a reassignment without a clear author, and an escalation that had asked security to move a calm passenger who had already provided proof. She said that the company accepted responsibility and would correct the record in full view of the people it served. Then she named each remedy one by one, not as bargaining points, but as commitments. Immediate accountability for those who mishandled the process, with suspension now and formal review to follow, within 30 days. A dignity, in service, and bias recognition program for every customer-facing employee, designed and delivered by an independent partner. An external, anonymous reporting line stood up within 72 hours, so concerns could be raised and tracked outside the company's internal chain. The creation of a $500,000 fund devoted to equity in travel, from scholarships to community partnerships to research on fair service, and a direct link between executive compensation and measurable improvements in dignity and inclusion, with quarterly public reporting. The words were quiet, but the room heard the sound that follows a decision. The gate fell silent in the way churches sometimes do when a prayer has been answered, not with thunder but with a still nod. Captain Richard Hayes stood straighter, as if to say he would carry out what was required. Laura Stevens did not look away from the screen. The radio on her belt whispered and fell still. Jessica Reed's fingers eased around the edge of her tablet, and her shoulders made the small adjustment people make when they lay down a burden they did not recognize until it leaves them. The older security officer kept his gaze on Naomi, a respectful line that said the center of the moment belonged where the harm had occurred. Applause did not burst so much as gather and rise. A sound that began near the doorway, where a mother with a stroller nodded and clapped into her palm, and then moved through the first-class cabin and along the gate benches as if the building itself had hands. Some passengers looked surprised by their own voices. Others smiled, the tired smiles of travelers who have seen too many announcements go the other way. Ethan Brooks, who had narrated food courts and sunsets and unexpected snow, found his tone settling into a register that carried gratitude without gloss. He told his listeners that the commitments were specific, that the timelines were near, and that the woman at the counter had kept her voice level even when the room tilted against her. In the chat, messages flickered like porch lights after a storm. Relief, resolve, a promise to watch what happened next, and memories from people who had once stood at desks where they were told to be reasonable and to complain later, and who knew how long later can be. Helen did one more thing that mattered. She addressed Naomi by name, thanked her for insisting on facts, and apologized without qualifiers to her and to everyone who had been asked to wait while doubt tried to take a seat it had not earned. She asked Laura to confirm that the original assignment would be honored now. Laura answered yes in a voice that carried both professionalism and the private recognition of the lesson. She asked the captain to describe the immediate steps that would allow the flight to depart under a crew not connected to the incident. He replied that a replacement team was being called and that the cabin would be reset in accordance with policy. She asked Jessica to step aside from today's duty pending review. Jessica nodded once, eyes clear, as if she had decided to learn whatever there was to learn here. The older security officer offered a simple, almost ceremonial line that he had witnessed a careful correction and that he appreciated being asked to keep a moment safe rather than to carry someone away from it. Naomi thanked Helen and the board for their decision and faced the people at the gate. She did not raise her hand for quiet arrived on its own. She spoke the sentence she had carried for this instant, the one that named the scale of what had just been done and the reason for doing it at all. This isn't just about me. It's about every passenger who deserves respect. The words did not perform. They settled. They found a place in the room and in the phones and in the quiet nods of strangers who had recognized something familiar in her steadiness. Doctor, Susan Miller's gaze softened in the way caregivers do when relief arrives. She offered Naomi a small smile that balanced gratitude with professional composure. Near the doorway, a man slid a bill into the barista's jar with an apologetic shrug and a wink. A private ritual of thanks for patience no one had asked for, and everyone had needed. A child asked a parent why everyone was clapping, and the parent bent to explain something simple and true about fairness in a voice meant to be remembered. Laura stepped forward, the line of duty visible but altered by the tone of her apology. She said she was sorry for the repeated requests, for the mismatch between system and document, and for the pressure that had been applied before the facts were fully gathered. She did not offer excuses. She did not bury the apology in clauses. She said the words cleanly, and then stood in the pause that followed. Naomi accepted the apology without ceremony, because dignity is often quiet, and because this day had already asked everyone to speak more slowly than habit. Captain Hayes added his own acknowledgement, saying he regretted that his final warning had arrived before a final check and that he would participate in whatever review the company required. Jessica said only that she understood and that she would learn. The words were small. They were large enough. The work of resetting a flight began. Agents moved with the brisk care of people putting a room back after a gathering. Signs were refreshed. The system's display corrected to the original seat. The gate area's energy shifted from spectacle to logistics. In the cabin, a flight attendant from the incoming team straightened a blanket and picked up a stray magazine with the unfussy competence that keeps air moving through a day. The older security officer thanked Naomi for her composure and stepped back with a nod that said his presence would recede as quickly as duty allowed. Ethan lowered his phone and spoke into the microphone with the same steady warmth, telling his audience that he would stay until the plane pushed back and then post a summary with the company's specific commitments spelled out in words, not slogans. In the stream, the blinking hearts of approval felt less like decoration than like 1,000 small agreements to remember. Naomi returned the paper boarding pass to her folio, not because she needed it now, but because it had served and deserved to be put away with care. She turned to the cluster of first-class passengers and said that she appreciated their patience. She told the rest of the gate that the delay would be short and that she believed it had purchased a better day for someone they would never meet. People smiled back in that American way that blends apology and solidarity with a tilt of the head and a murmured wish for a smooth flight. The doctor touched her own seat back as if blessing the square of space that had been momentarily contested and now reclaimed. Captain Hayes conferred with operations. Laura coordinated the crew change. Jessica, pale and still, stepped aside to wait for the formalities to begin. The call ended with the promise of a public statement, of an external hotline number to be posted on the airline's homepage within 3 days, of a calendar for training that would reach every gate and cabin within a month, and of a quarterly report that would tell the truth even when the truth felt inconvenient. The screen went dark. For a breath, the gate held the quiet that follows a benediction. And then ordinary life resumed its noises. Lids pressed onto cups. Zippers found their stops. Boarding passes rustled like leaves. A laugh rose and then shushed itself in respect for the moment that had just passed. Naomi felt the tiredness that follows a hard stillness and allowed it to pass through her without taking root. She had not won a prize. She had defended a principle, and the principle had agreed to go on living in a place where it was needed. She stepped back toward the jet bridge. The carpet underfoot gave a forgiving little spring, the kind that makes a person feel they are walking on something meant to carry weight. The light through the oval windows struck the fuselage in soft planes. She paused at the threshold long enough to glance at the forward galley where a new flight attendant adjusted a safety card, and then she crossed into the cabin she had left not long before. Faces turned. Not all of them knew exactly what had happened or why it mattered. Enough of them did. A man in a sports jacket tipped his head. A woman with gray hair gave a small lift of her fingers from her armrest, a salute that meant welcome back. Naomi answered each gesture with a look that carried thanks without asking for more attention than the situation already had taken. She reached her seat and set the folio on the tray, the leather warming to her touch. She placed the paper boarding pass beneath it as a small ceremony of closing. The plane felt different in a way that is hard to name. Lighter, not because gravity had changed, but because people sometimes breathe more easily when a fair thing has been done in the open. She sat, adjusted the belt, took a sip of water, and let her shoulders drop one notch. From the aisle behind her, Ethan leaned just close enough to be heard without intruding and spoke into his microphone, the timbre low and certain, as if writing a line meant to be kept. On the overhead display by the door, the status message refreshed with the promise of action to come, and the words glowed in simple, steady letters, "New crew, on the way." Naomi turned her head slightly toward the aisle as Ethan whispered, "This flight will go down in history." The first sunrise after Denver found the Atlanta skyline washed in the clear autumn light, the kind that makes glass and steel look almost honest. Naomi Carter sat at the long table in her office, a quiet floor above a city already moving, and opened the packet stamped with the airline's logo. It was the 72-hour report Helen Rogers had promised at the gate, a brief letter of accountability in plain language, a one-page outline of the interim dignity in service guidance pushed to every station, a single number at the top of a fresh external hotline that had begun taking calls before dawn, a calendar for the 30-day training to reach every gate and cabin in rolling waves, a short notice of a $500,000 fund established that morning with an independent foundation, and an addendum stating, in the careful prose lawyers and leaders share, that executive bonuses for the year ahead will be tied to measurable improvements in fairness and inclusion, and that those measures will be reported every quarter without euphemism. She read each page deliberately, as if truth needed the respect of being read slowly. Outside her window, a bus stopped. A driver raised a hand, a pedestrian smiled and waved back. Ordinary life kept choosing to continue, and today it seemed to do so with a steadier gait. Her assistant joined by video from a smaller conference room down the hall, the backdrop of muted framed photos making the call feel like a visit. They spoke about the pieces already moving. The external vendor contracted overnight to answer the hotline and triage calls with a nurse's steadiness. The packet of training materials that had landed in inboxes with a simple subject line, "Begin here," and the promise of a live session with questions encouraged rather than discouraged. The fund's early partners, a community college in the Midwest, and the Travelers Advocacy Group in the South. The draft of a public statement due at noon that would not hide behind phrases like "unfortunate incidents" or "misunderstandings occurred." They did not speak about winning. They spoke about maintenance, a word Naomi loved because it meant care-made routine. She walked down to the small cafe on the corner for a late morning coffee, the kind poured by a barista who knew that a sincere good morning could be a bomb. The line moved with the city's polite rhythm. Bills slid into a glass jar with the easy gratitude of people who remember to tip, not out of obligation alone, but out of habit shaped by respect. Naomi took her cup dark roast, a splash of milk, and sat near the window with the packet open again. The hotline number made a simple melody on the page when read aloud. She imagined the traveler speaking into it in a low voice from a quiet corner of a terminal and being met, at last, by someone who could do something now instead of later. On her screen, a notification pulsed. An excerpt from Ethan Brooks' recap had gone live. He had posted a clear timeline, the commitment spelled out in words rather than slogans, and a promise to check back in 30 days to see if the promises had become habits. The comments were a chorus of memory and resolve. She read 3 and put the phone face down, not to ignore them, but to let them live in the world without asking them to live in hers. By late afternoon, Helen called. The connection was clean. The background a modest office rather than a boardroom. Helen's voice carried the measured fatigue of someone who had not allowed fatigue to make decisions for her. She reported that Jessica Reed had stepped away from duty and enrolled in the new training, that Captain Hayes was participating in the review he had requested be thorough, that Laura Stevens had assigned herself to assist the rollout at 3 large hubs because she wanted to be part of the change she had helped require. Helen did not offer those updates as absolution, she offered them as proof of movement. Naomi listened and thanked her, not with the brittle cheerleaders sometimes trade, but with the grounded tone of a partner who would stay in the room when the cameras left. Evening came with the quiet relief that follows hard days done honestly. The city's traffic thickened. A delivery truck eased into a loading bay. A pair of cyclists glided through a yellow light with the grace of people who trust the road will make room. Naomi closed the packet, placed it in a folder marked with the date written in words, and slipped the folder into a drawer. She rested her fingertips on the desk for a beat longer than necessary, then stood to leave, her breath steady as a metronome. She had not sought a platform. She had attended to a principal that had been brought to her doorstep and asked to be let in. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun laid a warm square of light across the stage at the National Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta, and the room held an audience that understood the long arc of correction. The air carried the friendly solemnity of a congregation. Teachers near the back, a row of flight attendants in crisp jackets near the aisle, elders in Sunday shoes whose faces wore maps of marches and meetings, students with open notebooks and pens waiting to move, a handful of executives who had chosen to sit inside the story rather than read about it tomorrow. Naomi stood at the lectern with a glass of water and a sheaf of notes she would not need. Helen sat in the front row, the polite stiffness of a leader in public softened at the edges by the reassurance of work done and work yet to do. Off to one side, a cluster of employees waited to present on the training program that had become less a curriculum and more a conversation repeated until reflex changed. Naomi began with gratitude, not as a preface, but as an ethic. She thanked those who had done the quiet labor, the administrators who answered calls at midnight without making a show of sacrifice, the station managers who learned to say we were wrong without choking on the words, the agents who practiced listening as if it were a skill that could be improved, because it island. She spoke about outcomes with the humility facts deserve, complaint numbers that rose at first as people trusted the hotline and then fell as behaviors shifted, reports that were answered within days instead of vanishing, training attendance that reached into the high 90s, and surveys that reflected not relief alone, but the sturdier beginning of respect. She did not display charts. She painted the picture with sentences. Her voice, warm and paced to be heard, treated time as an ally rather than an enemy. Midway through, she invited a few voices to join her. A gate agent from a southern hub told the room about the first time she stopped herself mid-sentence and tried again, replacing a defensive explanation with a curious question. A senior flight attendant spoke of a conversation crew had had at a layover diner in a small Midwestern town, how they had passed the dessert menu around and spoken about dignity as if it were a recipe to be practiced, not a slogan to be pinned to a bulletin board. A young supervisor described the day a report came through the external line and how, for the first time in his career, the next steps were clear and the process felt less like a maze and more like a map. Their words did not sparkle. They carried weight. Then Naomi returned to the lectern and let the room settle. She told them that the measure of reform is not the number of press releases, but the number of people who no longer have to raise their voices to be heard. She told them that the company had kept its promise to link pay to progress, and that no one had left the executive table because of it. In fact, staying had become a choice made with clearer eyes. She acknowledged that mistakes still happened and will continue to happen because people still make decisions and will continue to make them. The point, she said, is that the system now leaned toward correction rather than concealment. Then she gave the line she had saved for this room, the sentence that turned an arc into a handle people could grasp. Change doesn't happen by chance, it happens when we demand it. The words landed with the soft thud of a truth that has been tested. People stood, not all at once, but in the way fields of grass rise after wind, a ripple that becomes a whole. Near the front, Helen's hands came together, not as a performance, but as acknowledgement. In the row behind her, a woman who resembled Jessica by more than a little sat with a small notebook open. When she lifted her head, The room could see in her eyes the mixture of humility and resolve that marks a person who has had to practice a lesson in public and has chosen to keep practicing it. In the back corner, a few young travelers in hoodies clap with the careful respect people offer when they enter a story already in progress and feel welcome there. The museum's air held the particular sweetness of rooms where apology has been given its due and where repair has been allowed to become a habit. When the applause settled, Naomi closed with thanks and a benediction for the ordinary safe flights, kind agents, announcements that speak plainly. Afterward, in the mellow light of the reception hall, conversations unfurled at round tables. A server carried a tray of small sandwiches and a bowl of punch. A kid in a dress shirt he would outgrow by spring leaned on a display and asked his aunt what executive compensation meant, and she explained it without making it sound like a riddle. Near the windows, Naomi and Helen stood side by side, accepting handshakes and stories. The man who had been reassigned from his IOC twice in 1 year and now had a note in his record that said, verified and well. The grandmother who had watched a gate agent stop, think, and try again, and had cried in the bathroom for a minute because it felt like a small miracle. Ethan Brooks slipped through the crowd with a microphone bearing the logo of a channel that had grown into something quieter and stronger than spectacle. He asked short questions, listened long, and signed off with the same promise he had made 2 years earlier, to check back, to confirm. As the evening lengthened, Naomi stepped aside to read a message on her phone. It was from the external hotline team, a simple note that a passenger at a far-off airport had just reported bias in the boarding queue, that the station manager had been alerted, and that the process was already in motion. She felt no triumph, only the agile calm that comes when the system you fought for begins to carry its own weight. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and turned toward the stage again, the corners of her mouth lifted by a smile that reached her eyes. Naomi looked out at the audience, smiled, hinting that the journey for justice was not over. The terminal was quiet now, the day's rush replaced by the soft echo of rolling luggage and the low hum of evening lights. Naomi's journey had begun with a single disputed seat, but it became a mirror that showed everyone present what dignity looks like when it stands its ground. Her calm insistence turned strangers into witnesses, and witnesses into participants in something larger than a boarding dispute. This story reminds us that justice is not always loud. It is often the quiet choice to hold steady when it would be easier to step aside. True reconciliation is not just about apology, but about rebuilding trust so the next traveler walks an easier road. Like the steady glow of a lantern on the porch, a single act of fairness can light the way through nights that once seemed endless. As you reflect on this story, think of the moments in your own life when standing firm made the path clearer for someone else. And if this story stirred something in you, consider sharing its warmth with someone who needs to be reminded that fairness is still possible.